All right. Well, thank you for joining us today. We are excited to be able to review this 30-minute webinar called Missional Metrics, in which we are going to help you identify and track your most important weekly and monthly key metrics. So one of the things that we hear a lot from executive directors in our work and leadership teams in general is that they're capturing a lot of great information, but they're having a really difficult time understanding how to use it. And in fact, in a recent survey, you can see here that only 6% of executive directors thought they were making good use of their data. So common to spend time and money capturing great information, putting big, good systems into play, but then, unfortunately, all too often, there can be a lot of trouble on the backside extracting that information and understanding how to review it, and most importantly, how you can evaluate the right metrics to drive impact. So before we jump right into, well, how do you know what to track on a weekly and monthly basis? We want to start with just emphasizing how important it is to have the right foundation in place. And if you've been on any of our webinars before, some of this might look familiar. You might recognize that we've done webinars just on how to create an organizational convictions one-pager. We're going to briefly touch on this. We always want to start here just to say that when you jump into having important discussions about your data, it's important that everybody around the room who's having those discussions is aligned and agrees on the convictions and core beliefs of your organization. So everyone's on the same page with your exist or mission statement. Everyone knows the core values, and those core values are being lived out and embodied in how you talk about data and how you review your key metrics. It might seem like those things are mutually exclusive, but they don't have to be. You can really bring passionate core values and fully live them out when you're talking about data and reviewing metrics. When you're thinking about this idealized future of how your organization is going to change the world, how you're going to create the future that you hope to see, this change the world target, you want to keep that in mind. Where's your true north? Where are you headed, like from a concrete, measurable perspective, 5 to 10 years from now? In this case, an example you can see on the screen is 10 years from now. And then this distinctive impact piece. This comes from the Good to Create for the nonprofit sector. We're really talking about what are the handful of metrics that we are trying to move, the outcomes we want to see based on our theory of change, based on the way we do our work. And you can see here for this particular fictional organization, it's about access to housing, jobs, increased social capital, and some other trends such as reduction in street homelessness. So we want to be on the same page with these things as we move into more granular reporting and looking at data on a weekly and monthly level. Another important foundation piece, and this is the last slide we'll hit before we get into the core meat of what we're going to discuss today, is as we are creating our reports, we want to hold these principles in play. And again, so how do we bring empathy into something like reviewing data and having discussions on key metrics? It is possible. And the first step is design process matters. So when you're determining what those reports are, what those key metrics are that you want to track, keep in mind who's going to be reviewing that information, whether it's a leadership team, whether it's a team of case managers or a team of fundraisers or marketers or an operations team. They need to be heavily involved in the process to say, well, these are the metrics that matter to us. And there needs to be a dialogue between, well, and these are the metrics, these are the overall measures that should matter based on the change the world target we're trying to hit, our annual priorities, our annual objectives, the key results we're aiming towards. So that design process is critical, and there needs to be an understanding moving both ways. What's the way the teams need to see the information so they can understand and make improvements, and then also how does it connect to the bigger goals of the organization? Less is more. We have a slide dedicated to this one. That's how important we think this is in the principles. I'd say of all these principles, this one is probably the most critical, only because it's all too common for organizations to think that more and more and more data that they're tracking is going to lead to better results when the opposite is true. But we'll hit a little bit more on that in the next slide. One cascading plan. This means as we set our important objectives and metrics and targets we want to hit at the top of the organization, and we move through down to more departmental level metrics, we want to make sure that there's connectivity there so that departments are working on metrics that are moving the ball forward on the top level targets of the organization. So that's what the cascading aspect of it is. These next two might seem a little different. Connecting with stories. So Often when you talk about data and metrics, it's about the quantitative aspect of measurement, right? But there's also a qualitative aspect of data. What are the key stories of transformation that are happening in your organization? We found that, in fact, if you just can lead a period of reviewing metrics with a story of a client who's maybe moved through your system or program, that really opens up and changes people's thinking and dialogue when they start to dive into the data. All of a sudden, when they look at the numbers, they realize every single number represents a person's story. So if we can connect and help people engage in that way as they're reviewing the data, going back to where we were before, that will help them bring empathy into the conversation, hold your core values in the conversation as well. And the last one here, data is a flashlight, not a hammer. What this means is we don't want to think of data as a purely uh, just sometimes people think of it as a punitive thing where we're coming in if the measures aren't getting better, someone's in trouble. And we've seen this unfortunately in unhealthy cultures and nonprofits or any organization in general. Instead, we want to say, how can the data shine a light on something to be learned so that we can improve? Now, that doesn't mean you don't have accountability. You absolutely do. But we want to lead with understanding and learning before we say lead with why questions or leaning into someone feeling maybe like they can't be open and truly exploring because of the way the conversation is moving. So data is a flashlight, not a hammer. That's the last principle. Okay, so as I said before, this less is more principle, this one's really important. Um, we've worked with organizations where they've got a key top level dashboard that's 50 metrics, or they've got a 4 tab with 20 metrics on each of them. And what tends to happen is it's hard for everyone in the organization to know what's important. When you have 50 to 80 metrics you're tracking, it's unlikely that you're going to gain the focus and traction on the most important things that you need to move forward in your organization. As opposed to what can happen when you have a handful of metrics, people can naturally and organically move in a line towards impacting them. If you repeat them over and over again, if they're seeing, oh, these are the 10 metrics that really matter to our organization, they're going to, whether they realize it or not, start moving towards impacting those in a positive way and start saying, well, gosh, is this key activity I'm engaged in actually leading to us advancing that? Or they might say, I'm not sure any of my work is leading to advancing those key metrics. And then they might say, we got to change that. What do we do to be better aligned and cascade from a process and activity engagement perspective to the metrics and impact we want to have? So that's a lot easier when you're starting and repeating a handful of ones versus dozens and dozens. So in order to do that, what we're going to focus on today is how do you identify metrics to track in a weekly rhythm and metrics to track in a monthly rhythm? So here's a little some descriptions of what you might think of as a weekly metric to track and a monthly. So on the weekly column here, they're meaningful as a point in time. So if you run them on today's Thursday, that's going to have meaning for Thursday, the 13th of August. And when I look at it on the 20th, it's going to have meaning. And looking at the trend of the weeks at this point in time over time, so at least 13 weeks history, is going to give you some insight that you need to see. It also gives you a pulse on the day-to-day operation. So sometimes I like to think about this as another word for it as a pulse report. And a way to think about it is if I only had access to 10 to 15 key metrics and I couldn't talk to anyone in my organization, what are those 10 to 15 key metrics I would want to see at a quick glance that would tell me, generally speaking, how things are going? It's not going to tell you everything, but it's going to tell you, do we have about the normal amount of intakes? Are we, if we're serving people food, are we serving about the same amount? Do we, um, is our cash on hand in a healthy spot for where it needs to be? Is it, if we're looking at it for last week, if we're kind of doing a week in review, did we have the right amount of donations that we would normally expect? Those kind of things. It can also function as an early warning system. So rather than waiting to close a period of time, like a monthly review, you can see on a weekly basis, is there something popping up, or you're seeing a few weeks of a trend that might seem alarming where you need to go look under the hood and look further. Oftentimes this report, this weekly pulse report, is not going to tell you exactly every little detail, but it's going to give you some strong indicators to say, I need to go do some further investigation and see what's going on here. And it's that investigation where you're going to really find out the real learning and see if you need to make some adjustments. And along those lines, you can track small or daily incremental change in these metrics that warrant attention. So keep that in mind. These things should be warranting attention. And the other way to think about these is their dashboard metrics. Reviewing these gives quick insight and quick actions that you can take. Now, as opposed to the monthly column over here, what this does is we want to get into a little bit deeper level of analysis and focused review. So you think you've got a team together, you're doing this once a month, probably you're identifying a day that would give enough time for data to be entered. So the second row here, you can see we're giving time to close the period, whether it's financial information or key programmatic information. You're saying the timeliness of data entry matters. And so let's say we're giving everybody 7 days to enter all the data, and then on the 8th or 9th or 2 more days to clean up the information. And then by the 10th or so, you're ready to review the information for the previous month. And when you're looking at that, you're looking at trends over a period of time. And you're looking at sustained changes over a defined period of time that would potentially warrant some significant decisions and changes to be made. So because the period of time is a longer period of time, it can be a month or two of a trend that looks maybe not what you thought it was going to be from an outcome perspective. Maybe lower numbers can tell you quite a bit. On the opposite side, if you're seeing some great results, you can also start to ask this question with the team: what do we need to replicate there? Should we be doing something in our other programs that we're seeing these positive trends that are happening in that line there? So, and last thing I'll say is, when you think about financial information, this is things like P&L information are great to see on a monthly versus like cash on hand would be more appropriate to see on a weekly statement there. So just a high-level overview of the different types of information for weekly and monthly when you're thinking about your key metrics. The next thing we encourage you to think about is often in nonprofit or missional-driven organizations, it's more natural to think about your programmatic outcomes. So this is the core of your mission, right? How many people are we helping get connected to adoptive parents? How many folks are we helping to move into permanent housing? How many folks are we helping to get jobs? How many children are we helping, are we serving through our after-school program? These kind of things, and whatever the programmatic outcome you want to see there, not just serving, but are experiencing this type of impact as a result of our intervention. Now, that's great, and you absolutely want to zero in on what those most important programmatic metrics are, but you also want to think about what are the operational metrics there. And the reason we're showing this strategy pyramid here, which by the way comes from the nonprofit strategy revolution, is to say that when you think about strategy, this organizational level, the top of the pyramid, these are the things that are going to change the trajectory of your organization. These are forming partnerships, standing up completely new service lines, maybe changing your position among your peers or in your market. This is like a new vision, like a shift in the way you do your business or you run your organization. These programmatic and operational metrics will underpin and give you an indicator of whether you are actually making progress on your strategic goals and your vision as a whole. So we want you to keep that in mind as you are thinking about creating your metrics, and whether they are weekly or monthly. You don't want to limit your thinking to programmatic. You will also want to think about the operational metrics that will shape those big organizational strategic goals that I just mentioned. And operational, just to be clear, that's more looking at your HR, your personnel, finance goals. If you run facilities, having some key facilities metrics, some key IT and information management metrics. Those are absolutely critically important. And when you ladder up and say, well, let's look at an HR metric. Well, why would it matter that we bring our or that we look at turnover as an example? Well, if we have people that are part of our organization longer and have deeper understanding of our work, they're more likely to have an impact on the people we're serving. So if you always ladder up to the why does that matter? You can quickly understand why these operational metrics are just as important as your programmatic metrics. So we want to encourage you to not forget about those as you're coming up with your key weekly and monthly metrics to track. We're going to go through a couple of examples just so you get an idea. What does a weekly pulse report look like, and what does a monthly review report look like? And so here you can see the format that we would recommend is, although we don't have all the columns, just for what you can fit on the screen here, at least 13 weeks of review. If you want to have more, that's great. You can always scroll or hide columns depending on the amount of history that you want to see. You want to create a target. This is really important for every week. And then you want to track that history week over week. So you'll have a period in time. We would recommend is looking at the previous week. So if you have this review, let's say you quickly review this as part of a weekly leadership meeting at the beginning of the meeting to make sure everyone's aligned on how you're doing and all your key metrics for the previous week. You have that understood that we're going to, let's say, run this every Tuesday morning. We're going to look at it. So all the data obviously got to be in there before then. This is usually the type of information that's being entered very close to real time anyway. So you're not so worried about timeliness of data entry because it's usually happening concurrently or within the same day. And that's another good filter to think about with regard to should this be a weekly or should this be a monthly target metric to track. And then you can see the types of things that we have on here. So number of intakes, number of clients served, number of job interviews, et cetera. And it's information that you can easily get to and resonates and makes sense in a weekly rhythm. The next one here is the monthly. So different format for how we would recommend looking at monthly data and different types of information. So these are going to be typically more outcome related and they might be information that takes a little bit more time for your team members to enter in. So something like a job placement or a housing placement, there might be detailed information to enter in around the employer or to enter in around the housing, the landlord or property information, for example, details of the lease, things like that. And you want to enter this in again with looking at, there's different ways you can look at the data, but the 4 ways that we would recommend is this month, last year, kind of rolling into the current fiscal year, and then the running 12 months. So you should see if we're 9 months into the fiscal year or 1 month into the fiscal year, maybe this month, if you look at the current one here, means that the fiscal year just started versus the running 12 months would look 12 months back. And so it's important to see the trends and understand the information in different ways so that you don't necessarily look at one data point and overreact. You need to have the context of the trends of the information in order to have a meaningful discussion about it, in order to say, and wonder if there's any changes that need to be made, any attention, increased resourcing or attention to any one of these issues. Okay, so a good way to brainstorm coming up with these metrics is to think about 4 key areas: your programmatic, developmental, marketing, financial, and operational. Come up with a list. Think of your change the world target, that big impact we talked about in the beginning, that distinctive impact. You remember from the example from the beginning of this, it was about job placements, housing placements, housing retention, reducing level of time people were homelessness, were what's called chronically homeless. They were kind of living on the streets. If you're knowing that distinctive impact, and that change the world target that you're working towards, what are the metrics that you need to be tracking and achieving in order to make progress towards those? After you get that list done, you can then begin to put them in the appropriate column, whether it's a weekly or a monthly. Put a star next to one, put a dot next to the other if it's a monthly, and use that process, that brainstorming process, to work your way down to a good starting spot for a weekly and a monthly. I'd say 10 to 12 metrics is a good place. If you have to stretch to 15, that's okay. Going beyond 15, again, we're going to lose focus and you're going to find that you're having a hard time gaining the appropriate alignment that you need for everyone to understand what are the most important ones. Another part that's really important here is oftentimes you'll see that once you've created your scorecards and you're having your discussion about them, someone will look at a metric and say, hey, where do we pull that information from? How do we calculate that? And so you want to have a definition here. And I would say just have this as a quick reference. So if you're in a focused meeting on this, have that key there. If you're just in a quick leadership meeting check, you can say, you know what, we'll pull that up later and reference it, or hopefully somebody over time just knows that information because the question has come up a few times. And the relevance here is that sometimes your key data can be pulled from multiple places. So let's look at a housing placement. You know, someone might say, oh, I thought that was pulled from the successful completion of a goal in an individualized plan. And someone else might say, oh no, my understanding was that our special outcome form that we had was where that was coming from. And someone else might say, oh, but we answered that question on our program exit form in which we indicate that they moved into permanent housing when we closed the file. I thought that was where it was pulled from. So it's critical that the definition is clear. It's coming from this spot, and everyone knows this is where we're pulling this information from. Because I hate to say this, but it's true. Half the time when you're looking at data, it's not that the trends aren't true, but it's just that the data isn't right. So we want to make sure that we are on the same page with the logic and the calculation, how it's being pulled, so that we can have more meaningful dialogue around the actual trends and not whether we're looking at good or bad data. Okay, once you get a hang of measuring your top level metrics on a weekly and monthly level, then you can move this down to department leaders and have them work on similar exercise, similar brainstorming exercise to determine what the most important metrics in their departments are, and from both a weekly and a monthly level, and how do they cascade up and fit into the overall top level metrics. So this is important. And again, if you're having heartburn around, oh gosh, just 10 to 15 metrics, that doesn't feel like a lot. We track so much more information. Well, this is where you can track that so much more information. So there's detailed financial metrics you want your financial leader to track. There's detailed operational metrics you want your operational leader to track those. And that's good. But we would say also go easy on yourself, like get a hang of and master the top level weekly and monthly metrics first. And when you feel like you're making some good traction, then move on down to the next level. Oftentimes organizations try to take on too much at once. And again, lack of focus can cause some inability to gain traction in making progress here. So start at top level and move down. And remember, less is more. So even at the departmental level, don't let the departmental leader go on and they have 30 metrics on their weekly sheet and 35 on their monthly. They also need to keep theirs succinct so their team is aligned and understands what the most important metrics are. Also, there's an adjustment period. So once you create these and you've got your weekly and your monthly scorecard, you're going to socialize these a bit and get feedback. And you're also going to realize that maybe you missed the mark on a few. You're looking at data and you're looking at trends, and it's not telling you what you hoped it would tell you. That's okay. If it's not telling you what you thought it would, then you need to have a discussion as a team as to whether you should continue to track it. It's much better to have that dialogue and decide to get to the right metric to track than just to continue to look at something that doesn't fluctuate or move very much, which isn't going to tell you that much information. So keep that in mind. It's okay to adjust. You're probably going to adjust a lot in the first quarter as you're doing this. And then I would say you probably want to look at adjusting just once a quarter if it's your monthly, and if it's your weekly, maybe just once a month. And remember to stick to 10 to 15 metrics, even if you adjust. The adjustment doesn't mean you get to keep adding and adding the number of metrics that you're tracking. Okay, and we want to show you that this isn't necessarily part of this webinar, but we want to help you understand how all this can fit in to alignment and focus on your most important metrics. So we talked about change the world. We talked about top outcomes and distinctive impact. This is what we call a missional data organizer. So how do we get our most important metrics and goals and targets on a couple pages of information so everyone in our organization knows this is from a concrete measurement perspective, this is where we're headed. Now, we're not suggesting this encapsulates the whole strategy and vision of an organization, but it should capture from a concrete measurable perspective where you are headed. So it's a very important aspect of your strategy that the organization is working towards. And again, you're starting here at a very top level. 10 years from now, where do we want to be? We want to move 2,000 people into permanent housing. And what are the top outcomes and distinctive impact we're focused on? You can see those here. Well, then what are our annual objectives for 2020? And what are the key results we want to see? All that means is how will we know that we have achieved the objective? Going down to the quarterly, what are the quarterlies we want to see? You can see this is Q1 2020 in order to make progress towards those annual ones. And on the back page, this is what we've been talking about today. And here are the key metrics that we track. And here's the target we have monthly, and here's who's responsible. So keep in mind, we want to have someone responsible for these so that it's not to say that they alone are the only person impacting that, but when it comes to being in charge of making adjustments and or providing input and feedback as to why a metric is a certain way, there's a key person responsible in each of these. So these two pages together, the first page and this back page, is what we call a missional data organizer. And we really believe when organizations can gather all this key information into two simple pages, it can bring incredible alignment and focus and drive results and impact in a way that you've never seen before. And again, the answer is simplicity, not complexity. All right, so what are some next steps? You can develop your weekly and monthly scorecard drafts using the brainstorm exercise that we reviewed. Again, start at top level, move down to your departments after that. And then once you've got some drafts of those, socialize them, get some feedback. That doesn't have to be very long, but just get some initial round, make adjustments, and then start populating that information. Assign responsibility for who will have those scorecard templates prepared and populate the data, and who will be responsible ultimately for the data being populated. And then set those review rhythms. So when are you going to look at this information every week? We would suggest a weekly leadership meeting or a weekly departmental meeting when you've got them down to the departmental level. And on the monthly level, who should be there? And again, think of key areas of responsibility and having a diverse mindset and voice in the room, so that when issues come up, you can turn to someone in the room who can speak to whatever issue is potentially popping up on those metrics that you're reviewing. And when are you going to do that every month? Again, we talked about having period to enter the data, close out properly. That's usually sometime around the 10th to 15th of the following month to look at the previous month to review on a monthly rhythm. So this is important. Oftentimes we get the data, we feel good, we've got the templates, we're populating, and then we're like, wait, who should be at this meeting and when should we review? These are just as critical. You got to have the right people in the room. You got to have the commitment and discipline to actually do it weekly and monthly and have that on the calendar. So don't forget that part. Next thing I wanted to share is that we've got a 2-day workshop coming up on September 23rd and 24th, in which we will walk organizations through this entire process. Over a couple of days, we would basically work on how do you drive results towards achieving your vision? How do you learn more about how an empathetic culture and results-based culture can coexist? And then from a deliverable perspective, you'd walk out of this workshop with your organizational convictions defined and your own missional data organizer that we just reviewed. And lastly, we'll spend some time in more detail talking about those important metric review rhythms, the times, who should be there, and even down to the detail of an agenda that we've prepared for. How do you facilitate a monthly detailed data review rhythm? So in a very healthy way that brings empathy and also drives results. All right, that is the end of our webinar. If there's any questions, you can reach out to me here. This is my email, or if you have any interest in the 2-day workshop, you can reach out to me here at my email, sean@missionmattersgroup.com. As always, we appreciate you joining us. It's been great. We do these every other week. You can track us on social media. You can look on our website, missionmattersgroup.com, to learn more about the topics that we will have. And we'd be excited to hear from you if you have any questions. All right. Thank you for joining us. Have a great day.